Police accuse a black woman in court. Moments later, the DOJ declares her their lead investigator. You're under arrest for obstructing justice. Let's see how smart you are behind bars. Those were the words that echoed through the courtroom, aimed at a black woman who had spent her career fighting for justice. But what if this was all part of a bigger plan? What if the real criminals were hiding in plain sight, using the law to cover their own tracks? When the Department of Justice steps in and exposes the truth, the entire courtroom is left speechless. What happens when those sworn to uphold justice are the ones corrupting it? Stay with me, because this story will unravel secrets, lies, and a moment of reckoning you won't believe. And before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more stories that uncover the truth. The hum of whispered conversations filled the courtroom as people shuffled into their seats. A mix of curiosity and disbelief painted across their faces. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive weight that only came with the anticipation of something monumental. At the front of the room, behind the polished wooden table designated for the defense, Alina Thomas sat with her back straight, her hands resting calmly on the table. Her eyes, dark and focused, scanned the room, lingering momentarily on the jury. Each face held a hint of judgment, a spark of doubt that felt like 1,000 tiny daggers piercing her resolve. Alina was no stranger to a courtroom. She had spent years inside these walls, though always on the other side of the room. As a lawyer-turned-investigator for the Department of Justice, she had built her career exposing corruption and championing justice. But today, she was no hero in their eyes. Today, she was the accused. At the prosecutor's table, Sergeant John Coleman leaned back in his chair, an air of smug confidence radiating from him. His broad shoulders filled out his navy blue police uniform, the glint of his badge catching the light as he exchanged whispered words with the prosecutor. Every now and then, his piercing blue eyes would flicker toward Alina, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. It was the kind of smirk that said, "I've already won." "Order in the court," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. The room fell silent as the judge, an older man with silver hair and a stern expression, entered and took his seat at the bench. His gavel came down with a sharp crack, setting the tone for what was to follow. "This court is now in session," the judge declared. "The people versus Alina Thomas." The prosecutor rose, a tall man with an angular face and a rehearsed sense of authority. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with the kind of overconfidence that comes from years of prosecuting cases he believed to be open and shut. "The evidence against the defendant is overwhelming." Alina Thomas, under the guise of conducting an investigation, tampered with crucial evidence in an active police case, thereby obstructing justice and compromising the integrity of law enforcement. Alina's lawyer, Lauren Nash, shifted uncomfortably beside her. Lauren was young, idealistic, and brilliant, but Alina could see the unease in her eyes. They both knew this case was more than it seemed. The charges were not just about evidence tampering. They were a weapon wielded by a corrupt system desperate to protect itself. "Miss Thomas," the judge addressed her directly, his tone measured but carrying an edge of skepticism. "You stand accused of serious crimes. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Alina said, her voice steady, each word enunciated with deliberate precision. She refused to falter, even under the weight of the stares pressing down on her. The prosecutor wasted no time. He launched into his opening statement, weaving a narrative designed to paint Alina as a reckless, self-serving individual who had betrayed the public trust. He presented documents, emails, and snippets of police reports, all meticulously doctored to point toward her alleged guilt. As the evidence was projected onto a large screen, Alina felt the eyes of the jury boring into her. She caught snippets of their reactions, a furrowed brow here, a tight-lipped frown there. Each flicker of doubt was a victory for the prosecution. And then, Sergeant Coleman took the stand. The room seemed to hold its breath as he walked to the witness box, his boots clicking against the tiled floor. Once seated, he swore his oath with the ease of someone who had done it 100 times before. "Sergeant Coleman," the prosecutor began, pacing in front of him like a predator circling its prey. "Can you tell the court about the defendant's actions during the investigation?" Coleman leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together in a show of sincerity. "Yes, sir." "Miss Thomas, excuse me." The defendant repeatedly overstepped her boundaries, accessing files she had no authorization to view and interfering with ongoing investigations. When we confronted her about her actions, she became defensive, refusing to explain herself. And what were the consequences of her interference? The prosecutor asked, his voice heavy with feigned indignation. Critical evidence was lost, Coleman replied, his tone somber. Evidence that could have brought closure to the victims' families. Her actions not only hindered our progress, but put our entire case at risk. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Alina remained motionless, her face a mask of calm, but inside, she could feel the frustration building. Every word out of Coleman's mouth was a lie, a carefully constructed narrative designed to bury the truth. As Lauren rose to cross-examine, the tension in the room thickened. Sergeant Coleman, she began, her tone firm. You've stated that the defendant accessed files without authorization. Can you provide documented proof of this? Coleman hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Alina to notice. The records were corrupted during the tampering, he said smoothly, recovering his composure. But my team and I witnessed it firsthand. How convenient, Lauren said, arching an eyebrow. No records, just your word. The exchange continued, each question and answer a strategic move in an intricate game of chess. But no matter how skillfully Lauren pressed, Coleman remained evasive, his lies protected by the veneer of his uniform. As the day dragged on, the weight of the prosecution's case loomed large. Alina could feel the tide turning against her, the narrative of her guilt sinking deeper into the minds of the jury. But she wasn't done yet. Sitting silently, her hands clasped in her lap, she glanced at the clock on the wall. The time was approaching. She had been waiting for this moment, the precise second when everything would shift. Unbeknownst to everyone in the room, the wheels of justice were already in motion, just not in the way they expected. The next morning, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Word of the case had spread quickly through Stonebridge, a town that thrived on gossip and drama. The seats were filled with onlookers, some who had taken the day off from work, others who simply wanted a front-row seat to the spectacle of a fall from grace. Reporters with notepads and cameras lined the back wall, waiting to capture any moment that could become tomorrow's headline. Alina sat quietly at the defense table, her hands folded neatly, her expression unreadable. She had spent the night in quiet reflection, replaying every moment of the trial so far. Every lie Sergeant Coleman had told, every glance exchanged between the prosecutor and the judge, every muffled chuckle from the officers who sat smugly in the gallery. They believed they had already won, but Alina knew better. Lauren arrived a few minutes before the judge entered, clutching a stack of documents close to her chest. She slid into her seat beside Alina and leaned in, her voice low. They've stacked the deck against us, Lauren whispered, her eyes scanning the courtroom as though the walls themselves were listening. I've gone over the evidence they've submitted. It's shaky at best, but without something solid to counter it, the jury might buy into their story. Alina nodded slightly, her gaze fixed on the door. She wasn't worried, not yet. Timing was everything, and she knew the time wasn't quite right. Just stick to the plan, she said softly, her voice calm and deliberate. Lauren hesitated but nodded. She trusted Alina, even if she didn't fully understand her confidence. The judge entered with his usual stern demeanor, the gavel striking sharply to call the court to order. As the prosecutor began presenting the day's evidence, the mood in the room shifted. Emails and documents were displayed on the screen, each one purporting to show Alina's supposed misconduct. There were accusations of unauthorized access, altered records, and even evidence tampering. To the untrained eye, it looked damning, but Alina noticed the details, the timestamps that didn't align, the formatting inconsistencies, the subtle signs of manipulation that would go unnoticed by anyone unfamiliar with investigative work. She sat quietly, absorbing every word, every visual, every fabricated claim. Lauren stood for the cross-examination, her voice steady as she began to pick apart the evidence. Mr. Davis, she addressed the prosecutor, these emails you've presented, do you have metadata to support their authenticity? The prosecutor hesitated, glancing briefly at Coleman before responding. The metadata was unavailable at the time of submission. However, the content of the emails is clear and speaks for itself. Lauren raised an eyebrow. So you're asking this court to trust the content of documents that cannot be independently verified? The prosecutor bristled. The evidence was provided by a reputable source. Reputable? Lauren interrupted, her tone sharp. The same source that is under investigation for corruption and misconduct? A murmur rippled through the room. The prosecutor's face darkened, but he quickly recovered. The investigation is ongoing and irrelevant to this case. Is it? Lauren asked, stepping closer to the jury. Or is it possible that this so-called evidence is part of a larger effort to discredit my client and protect those who are truly guilty? Before the prosecutor could respond, the judge interjected. Enough, Miss Nash. Keep your questions focused on the evidence presented. Lauren nodded, backing down for the moment, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The jury shifted in their seats, their expressions less certain than they had been the day before. When Sergeant Coleman was called back to the stand, the room tensed. He walked with the same confidence as before, his uniform pristine, his badge polished. He adjusted the microphone and leaned back in his chair, a picture of authority. Sergeant Coleman, Lauren began, you testified yesterday that Miss Thomas accessed files without authorization. You also claimed that critical evidence was lost as a result of her actions. Is that correct? That's correct, Coleman replied, his voice steady. Lauren approached the stand, holding up a stack of papers. These are logs from the department's internal system, she said, her tone casual but deliberate. Can you confirm that these are accurate records? Coleman glanced at the papers but didn't reach for them. I'm not familiar with those specific logs. Lauren smiled faintly. Interesting, because these logs show that the files in question were last accessed by your credentials, not Miss Thomas's. Can you explain that? A hush fell over the courtroom. Coleman's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. I don't recall that. You don't recall? Lauren pressed. Or is it possible that you accessed those files and then altered the records to implicate my client? Objection, the prosecutor shouted, rising from his seat. Speculation. Sustained, the judge said, though his eyes lingered on Coleman. Lauren took a step back, her expression calm. No further questions for now. The tension in the room was palpable. As the day dragged on, Alina remained composed, her demeanor unshaken even as the prosecution continued their assault. But she could see the cracks forming, the inconsistencies in Coleman's testimony, the shifting body language of the jury, the prosecutor's growing frustration. As the court adjourned for the day, Alina stood and gathered her things. Lauren turned to her, her voice low. You planted the seed today, but we need more if we're going to turn this around. Alina nodded. Tomorrow, she said simply. Lauren frowned, but before she could respond, a man entered the courtroom. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, and carried an air of authority that silenced the room. He approached Alina, handing her a sealed envelope. From the DOJ, he said quietly before turning and walking away. Alina opened the envelope, her expression unreadable as she read the contents. Then, for the first time that day, she smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a chill down Lauren's spine. Tomorrow, Alina repeated, her voice carrying a weight that hinted at the storm about to break. The following morning, the courtroom was cloaked in an air of expectation. The whispers among the crowd seemed heavier now, more speculative. The drama of the previous day had left everyone on edge. They were here for a show, and whether they rooted for Alina's redemption or her downfall, they couldn't look away. Alina arrived early, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored black suit. She carried herself with an air of calm authority, as though the accusations against her were a mere formality. She took her seat at the defense table and laid a slim leather folder in front of her. It was the same folder she had received the day before, its contents still a mystery to everyone but her. Lauren joined her moments later, a look of both determination and curiosity on her face. You've been quiet about what's in that envelope, Lauren said under her breath, sitting down beside her. You'll see soon enough, Alina replied, her voice soft but firm. Just follow my lead. Lauren opened her mouth to probe further, but before she could, the judge entered. The gavel struck, silencing the murmurs and signaling the day's proceedings. This court is now in session, the judge announced. We will continue with the testimony of Sergeant John Coleman. Coleman returned to the stand, but the confidence he had carried the past 2 days seemed to have dulled slightly. His gaze darted around the room, his hands fidgeting as he adjusted the microphone. The faintest crack in his demeanor, but one Alina didn't miss. Lauren began her cross-examination slowly, methodically. Sergeant Coleman, you testified yesterday that Miss Thomas accessed and tampered with critical files related to an active investigation. Can you confirm once again that these files were directly linked to her alleged interference? Coleman nodded, but the movement was stiff. Yes, I can confirm that. Lauren tilted her head, her tone sharpening. And you're certain that no one else could have accessed these files? That there was no possibility of internal error or external manipulation? There's no possibility, Coleman replied quickly, too quickly. His answer hung in the air, brittle and unconvincing. Lauren paused, letting the silence stretch before stepping closer to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, addressing them directly, we've heard Sergeant Coleman repeatedly claim that my client is solely responsible for tampering with evidence. Yet, as we saw yesterday, the department's own logs raised serious questions about who actually accessed these files. She turned back to Coleman, her eyes narrowing. Sergeant, are you familiar with Section 42 of the Federal Evidence Integrity Act? Coleman blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. Yes, he said cautiously. It pertains to the handling and preservation of evidence. Lauren nodded, her expression unreadable. Correct. And are you aware that any evidence submitted in federal court must include a verified chain of custody, including metadata logs and access records? Yes, Coleman replied, his voice tighter now. Lauren stepped back to the defense table, retrieving the leather folder Alina had placed there earlier. She held it up for the court to see. This, she said, her voice steady and deliberate, is a certified audit report from the Department of Justice, conducted as part of their ongoing investigation into the Stonebridge Police Department. It includes detailed metadata logs and chain of custody records for the very files Sergeant Coleman claims my client tampered with. The room fell deathly silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting to one of interest. Lauren opened the folder, pulling out a crisp, stapled report. According to this audit, she continued, the files in question were accessed multiple times by Sergeant Coleman himself, both before and after my client was assigned to the investigation. In fact, the audit reveals irregularities in the department's handling of these files, including unauthorized edits made under Sergeant Coleman's credentials. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Coleman's face turned pale, his jaw tightening as he visibly struggled to maintain his composure. Objection! The prosecutor shouted, rising from his seat. This audit has not been submitted as evidence. Your Honor, Lauren interrupted smoothly. This audit was conducted by the Department of Justice, whose authority supersedes this court. We received the report yesterday and have submitted it for immediate review. The judge glanced at the prosecutor, then at Lauren. I'll allow it. Proceed. Lauren placed the report on the evidence table, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Sergeant Coleman, can you explain why your credentials appear on these logs? Why you accessed these files multiple times without proper documentation? And why, after your edits, the files mysteriously implicated my client? Coleman opened his mouth, but no words came out. He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting to the prosecutor for support. Lauren didn't wait for his response. You can't explain it, can you? She pressed, her voice rising slightly. Because the truth is, this entire case was fabricated to discredit Miss Thomas and protect your own corruption. Objection! The prosecutor yelled again, but his voice lacked the force it had earlier. Overruled, the judge said, his tone now tinged with suspicion. The room was electric with tension as the jury absorbed the revelation. Alina sat silently, her hands clasped in her lap, her expression calm and resolute. She knew the tides were turning. Lauren returned to the defense table, leaning in to whisper to Alina. That was a hell of a move, she said, her voice trembling slightly with adrenaline. But we're not out of the woods yet. Alina gave her a faint smile. The woods are thinning. As the day wore on, the focus shifted back to Coleman. His attempts to defend himself grew weaker with each passing minute, his credibility crumbling under the weight of the DOJ's audit. By the time the court adjourned, the smug confidence he had carried at the start of the trial was nowhere to be seen. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing as Alina and Lauren exited together. Questions were shouted, microphones thrust forward, but Alina ignored them all, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Tomorrow, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Tomorrow, the storm breaks. The courtroom was uncharacteristically quiet the next morning. The usual whispers and murmurs that marked the start of the day had vanished, replaced by a palpable tension that wrapped itself around the room like a coiled spring. It wasn't just the trial that had shifted, it was the balance of power. Everyone could feel it. Alina Thomas sat at the defense table, her posture as poised and resolute as ever. She exuded an aura of quiet strength, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the nervous energy radiating from the prosecution's side. The once confident prosecutor was flipping through papers with a visible tremor in his hands, and Sergeant Coleman, seated a few rows behind him, looked like a shadow of the man who had taken the stand days earlier. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tightly, and his eyes betrayed the weight of his unraveling lies. Lauren Nash leaned in close to Alina, her voice barely above a whisper. "The judge is going to allow the DOJ to address the court today," she said, her tone tinged with both excitement and caution. "This is big, but we need to stay sharp. They're going to fight this with everything they have." Alina nodded, her gaze steady. "Let them try," she replied simply. The gavel came down, and the room stilled. The judge's expression was unreadable, but his voice carried a note of gravity as he addressed the courtroom. "Before we proceed with the defense's case, the court will hear from a representative of the Department of Justice regarding their ongoing investigation into the Stonebridge Police Department. This testimony is directly relevant to the charges against the defendant." A murmur rippled through the crowd as a woman in a sharp navy suit stepped forward. Diane Evans, a high-ranking official with the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, took the stand with an air of authority that silenced the room. Her every movement was deliberate, her presence commanding. "Miss Evans," the judge began, "please state your name and position for the record." Diane Evans, Deputy Director of the Civil Rights Division, United States Department of Justice, she said, her voice clear and steady. The judge nodded. "You may proceed." Diane adjusted the microphone slightly, her sharp gaze sweeping the courtroom. "The Department of Justice has been conducting an extensive investigation into allegations of corruption and misconduct within the Stonebridge Police Department," she began. "This investigation has uncovered systemic issues, including evidence tampering, abuse of power, and targeted harassment of individuals within the community. These findings directly implicate several high-ranking officers, including Sergeant John Coleman." The courtroom erupted into gasps and whispers. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the tension in the room was now electric. Diane continued, unfazed. "As part of this investigation, Miss Thomas was assigned as an undercover investigator to gather evidence of these practices. Her work was critical in exposing the extent of the misconduct, including the deliberate framing of innocent individuals to protect the interests of corrupt officers." She turned to the jury, her expression grave. "The charges against Miss Thomas are not only baseless, but are part of a coordinated effort by members of the Stonebridge Police Department to discredit her and obstruct our investigation." The prosecutor shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Sit down." The judge snapped, his voice firm. The prosecutor froze, clearly stunned. "Miss Evans, please continue." Diane nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. To support these claims, the DOJ has submitted a detailed report to the court, including evidence of falsified records, unauthorized access to investigative files, and communications between Sergeant Coleman and other officers discussing their plans to implicate Miss Thomas." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "Additionally, we have obtained recordings that capture conversations between Sergeant Coleman and his colleagues in which they explicitly discuss fabricating evidence to ensure Miss Thomas's removal from the investigation." Another wave of gasps swept through the room. Sergeant Coleman's face turned ashen, and his hands gripped the edge of the bench in front of him so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Lauren rose from her seat, a new confidence in her step as she approached the stand. "Miss Evans," she said, her voice calm but purposeful, "can you confirm for the court whether these recordings and other evidence directly implicate Sergeant Coleman in acts of corruption?" "I can," Diane replied without hesitation. "The recordings not only implicate Sergeant Coleman, but also several other officers who conspired with him. The evidence is unequivocal." Lauren nodded, her gaze shifting to the jury. "And can you confirm that Miss Thomas's actions throughout this investigation were authorized and conducted under the supervision of the DOJ?" "Yes," Diane said firmly. "Miss Thomas was acting in her official capacity as a lead investigator for the Department of Justice. Her actions were lawful, necessary, and instrumental in exposing corruption within the Stonebridge Police Department." Lauren let the words hang in the air for a moment before returning to the defense table. The prosecution remained silent, their case crumbling before their eyes. As Diane stepped down, the judge addressed the courtroom. Given the gravity of the evidence presented, this court will adjourn briefly to review the DOJ's findings. We will reconvene shortly. The gavel came down, and the room erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled for their phones, spectators whispered furiously, and Coleman remained frozen in his seat, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Alina stood, her expression unreadable as she gathered her things. Lauren turned to her, her eyes wide. "This is it," she said, her voice barely containing her excitement. "They don't have a leg to stand on anymore." Alina nodded, her gaze steady. "The storm's here," she said quietly. "Now we see who survives it." She walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, the murmur of voices fading behind her. Outside, the sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of rain. The storm had indeed arrived, but it wasn't nature's wrath that would leave its mark on this day. It was justice. The courtroom was eerily silent when it reconvened. The tension, which had been simmering over the past few days, now boiled into a heavy, suffocating presence. No one dared speak above a whisper, the weight of what had been revealed still pressing down on everyone present. Outside, the skies had darkened, the faint rumble of thunder in the distance adding an almost cinematic backdrop to the events unfolding inside. Alina Thomas entered with the same composed demeanor she had carried since day one. But today there was something different, a subtle shift in her energy. It wasn't defiance or even relief. It was the quiet confidence of someone who knew the truth was finally on her side. Lauren Nash walked beside her, clutching her legal pad with a white-knuckled grip. She had spent the recess going over every detail of the DOJ report, committing it to memory. Despite her best efforts to remain calm, her excitement bled through in the way she tapped her pen against her thumb. The pieces were falling into place, and for the first time since the trial began, the path forward was clear. As Alina took her seat at the defense table, her eyes scanned the room. The gallery was packed, as it had been every day, but the atmosphere had shifted. The smug glances from Sergeant Coleman's supporters were gone, replaced by a mix of apprehension and unease. Even the prosecutor, who had spent the last few days radiating overconfidence, now avoided her gaze, his shoulders hunched as he shuffled through his notes. Coleman sat in the back row, his posture rigid, his face pale. He had exchanged his usual air of dominance for one of barely concealed dread. His gaze darted toward the door every few seconds as though he were contemplating making a run for it. Alina didn't need to look at him for long. She already knew how this day would end. The judge entered, his expression unreadable but his movements slower than usual, as if weighed down by the gravity of what he had just reviewed. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and surveyed the room before bringing his gavel down. "This court is now in session," he said, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "The court has thoroughly reviewed the evidence submitted by the Department of Justice, including the audit report and recorded communications involving members of the Stonebridge Police Department. What we have seen raises serious and deeply troubling concerns about the integrity of this case." The prosecutor flinched as the judge's gaze fell on him. "Mr. Davis," the judge continued, "it is apparent that the charges brought against Miss Thomas were based on manipulated evidence and orchestrated by individuals who sought to obstruct justice. This behavior undermines not only the credibility of this case, but the very foundation of our legal system." Lauren cast a quick glance at Alina, her eyes wide with disbelief. This level of candor from the bench was rare, and it was clear the judge wasn't holding back. The judge turned his attention to Lauren. "Miss Nash, the court acknowledges the diligence of your defense and the critical role of the DOJ in uncovering this misconduct. Effective immediately, all charges against your client are dismissed with prejudice." A collective gasp swept through the room, quickly followed by murmurs and whispers. Lauren exhaled sharply, her shoulders relaxing as the words sank in. She turned to Alina, her smile breaking through the tension. "It's over," she whispered. But Alina didn't smile. She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the judge. "Not yet," she murmured. As the judge prepared to adjourn, Diane Evans rose from her seat. "Your Honor, if I may," she said, her tone respectful but firm. The judge gestured for her to proceed. Diane stepped forward, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "While this court has rightfully dismissed the charges against Miss Thomas, it is imperative to address the broader implications of what has been uncovered. The actions of Sergeant Coleman and his associates represent a gross abuse of power and a violation of public trust. The Department of Justice intends to pursue criminal charges against all parties involved in this corruption. She turned, her gaze locking onto Coleman. Sergeant Coleman, you and your colleagues have not only betrayed the citizens of Stonebridge, but have also endangered the integrity of every case you've ever touched. This is not just about Miss Thomas. It's about every victim of your corruption. And I assure you, justice will be served. Coleman's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He shifted in his seat, his mouth opening and closing as though he wanted to respond, but couldn't find the words. Diane looked back at the judge. Your Honor, we request that Sergeant Coleman be taken into custody immediately pending further investigation. The judge nodded. Bailiff, he said simply. The room erupted into chaos as the bailiff approached Coleman. He shot to his feet, his voice rising in desperation. This is ridiculous. I was doing my job. You can't do this. But the bailiff was unmoved. Sergeant Coleman, you're under arrest, he said, his tone flat as he secured the handcuffs around Coleman's wrists. The once confident officer was led out of the courtroom, his protests fading as the doors closed behind him. Alina watched the scene unfold with a calm detachment. This wasn't satisfaction, it was justice. And justice, she had learned, rarely came with the kind of triumph one might expect. It was quiet, deliberate, and most importantly, inevitable. As the courtroom began to empty, Lauren turned to Alina, her eyes bright with relief. You did it, she said, her voice tinged with awe. You really did it. Alina shook her head. We did it, she corrected, and it's not over yet. This is just the beginning. Later that evening, as Alina stepped out of the courthouse, she was met with a wave of reporters and supporters. Cameras flashed, and questions were shouted, but she ignored them all, her focus on the horizon. The storm clouds that had loomed overhead all day were beginning to clear, the faint glow of the setting sun breaking through. Justice had been served, but her work was far from finished. There were more battles to fight, more truths to uncover. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, the weight of the day finally beginning to lift. She turned to Lauren, a faint smile playing on her lips. Let's go, she said. We have work to do. And with that, Alina walked away from the courthouse, her steps steady and unyielding, ready to face whatever came next. The air outside the courthouse was heavy with the humidity of an impending storm, though the rain still lingered on the horizon. The buzz of reporters clamoring for sound bites grew fainter as Alina Thomas walked down the stone steps, her heels clicking softly against the polished surface. She could still hear the shouted questions trailing after her. Miss Thomas, how do you feel about the charges being dropped? Do you have a statement for the citizens of Stonebridge? What's your next move? Alina ignored them, her focus inward, her thoughts circling like restless waves. Lauren Nash kept close to her side, her hand clutching the strap of her leather bag as though it were an anchor. They had agreed to forego any immediate statements. There would be time for press conferences and interviews later. For now, Alina needed space to process the day's events. As they reached the edge of the courthouse lawn, Lauren broke the silence. It still doesn't feel real, she said, her voice low. 1 minute they had you on the ropes, and the next. She shook her head, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I don't think I've ever seen a courtroom turn so fast. Alina glanced at her, a faint smile softening her features. The truth has a way of doing that, she replied. It just takes patience and the right timing. Lauren stopped walking, turning to face her. I don't know how you stayed so calm through all of this. I mean, even when it looked like they had you pinned, you never flinched. Alina paused, her gaze drifting to the courthouse behind them. The towering structure loomed against the darkening sky, its stone facade weathered but resilient. Because I knew what was at stake, she said quietly. This wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's been silenced, every victim of corruption who never got their day in court. If I cracked, if I gave them even a moment of doubt, they would have used it to tear everything apart. Lauren nodded slowly, her admiration evident. Still, you carried the weight of this case on your shoulders. I don't know how you do it. Alina's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet resolve. Because I've seen what happens when no one does. They reached a quiet cafe a few blocks from the courthouse, a place Alina had frequented during her time in Stonebridge. The interior was modest and unassuming, the kind of place where people went to blend into the background. She chose a booth near the window, the city's bustling streets just visible through the rain-streaked glass. Lauren sat across from her, setting her bag down with a sigh of relief. "I feel like I haven't eaten in days," she said with a laugh, scanning the menu. Alina nodded absently, her attention drawn to the muted television mounted on the wall. The local news was airing a live segment on the trial, the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen. "Corruption scandal rocks Stonebridge Police Department. Sergeant Coleman arrested." The anchor's voice was somber as she recounted the details, her expression a mix of shock and measured professionalism. Alina watched as footage of Coleman being led out of the courtroom played on a loop, his once proud posture reduced to a hunched shuffle. The image should have brought her satisfaction, but instead, it left her with a hollow ache. "This is only the beginning," she murmured, more to herself than to Lauren. Lauren looked up from her menu. "What do you mean?" Alina leaned back in her seat, her fingers tracing the edge of her water glass. Coleman wasn't acting alone. The corruption in Stonebridge runs deep, deeper than what we uncovered in this case. There are more officers, more victims, more lives that have been affected. Taking him down is just one step in a much larger fight. Lauren studied her, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "You're already thinking about the next case, aren't you?" Alina met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "I have to," she said simply. "If I stop now, then everything we've done, everything we fought for, means nothing." The waitress arrived with their orders, placing a plate of warm pasta in front of Lauren and a simple salad in front of Alina. Lauren dove into her meal with enthusiasm, but Alina picked at her food, her mind still elsewhere. "Do you ever get tired?" Lauren asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Of always having to fight." Alina set her fork down, her gaze distant. "All the time," she admitted. "But then I think about the people who don't have the resources, the knowledge, or the voice to fight for themselves. And I realize I don't have the luxury of being tired." Lauren was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You know, you're not alone in this. You've got people who believe in you, who are willing to help. You don't have to carry it all by yourself." Alina looked at her, a flicker of gratitude softening her eyes. "I know," she said, "and I'm grateful for that. But there are some battles that only I can fight." As they left the cafe, the rain had finally begun to fall. It was a gentle drizzle, the kind that softened the edges of the city and made everything feel a little quieter. Alina pulled her coat tighter around her as they walked, the cool air biting at her skin. Lauren hesitated at the corner, glancing at Alina. "You're heading back to DC soon, right?" Alina nodded. "Tomorrow. There's still work to be done on the DOJ's end." Lauren smiled faintly. "Well, if you ever need a lawyer who's not afraid to take on a corrupt system, you know where to find me." Alina returned the smile, a rare warmth in her expression. "I'll keep that in mind." They parted ways at the corner, Lauren disappearing into the crowd while Alina lingered for a moment, her gaze turned toward the courthouse in the distance. The rain blurred its sharp lines, making it seem almost ethereal. As she stood there, a single thought echoed in her mind, a promise to herself and to the countless people who had been silenced for far too long. The fight isn't over. It's only just begun. With that, she turned and walked into the rain, her steps steady, her purpose clear. The quiet hum of the airplane filled the cabin as Alina stared out the window, the city of Stonebridge shrinking beneath her. From this altitude, the sprawling streets and clusters of buildings seemed insignificant, their edges softened by the haze of distance. Yet, in those streets lay lives she had touched, people she had fought for without ever meeting them. The thought gave her a fleeting sense of accomplishment, but it was quickly overshadowed by the heaviness of what still lay ahead. The stewardess passed by with a polite smile, offering refreshments to the passengers, but Alina declined, her thoughts too tangled to be unraveled by a cup of coffee. She leaned back in her seat, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had won the battle, yes, but the war was far from over. When the plane touched down in Washington, D.C., the familiar chaos of the capital greeted her. The hum of engines, the hurried footsteps of travelers, and the clipped voices of announcements over the PA system all blended into a symphony of movement and purpose. Alina moved through it with quiet efficiency, her steps purposeful as she made her way to the terminal exit. Waiting for her at the curb was Diane Evans, leaning casually against a sleek black SUV. Her sharp navy suit was immaculate as always, and her expression was one of calm professionalism. But as Alina approached, Diane's eyes softened, a rare flicker of warmth breaking through her usual composure. Welcome back, Diane said, opening the door for her. Thanks, Alina replied, sliding into the passenger seat. As Diane settled behind the wheel, Alina let out a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly in the presence of someone who understood the weight she carried. The city blurred past as they drove, the familiar landmarks slipping into view. The towering Washington Monument, the stately facade of the Lincoln Memorial, the sprawling lawns of the National Mall. Alina had lived here for years, but the sights never lost their power to ground her, to remind her of the ideals she fought to uphold. Diane glanced at her as they stopped at a red light. The fallout in Stonebridge is making waves, she said. Coleman's arrest has already triggered multiple investigations into other officers. And the DOJ report? It's all over the news. People are talking, Alina. They should be. Alina replied, her tone measured. What happened in Stonebridge isn't unique. It's a symptom of a much larger problem. The more people talk, the harder it'll be for them to ignore. Diane nodded, her hands gripping the steering wheel. You've set a fire, that's for sure. But you know as well as I do, fires like this need constant tending. Otherwise, they burn out, and everything goes back to the way it was. Alina turned to her, her gaze steady. That's why I'm here. The DOJ headquarters was a fortress of glass and steel, its towering structure a physical manifestation of authority and accountability. As Alina entered the building, the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh coffee greeted her. Colleagues nodded in acknowledgement as she passed, their expressions a mix of respect and curiosity. News of the Stonebridge case had spread quickly through the halls, and her name was now on everyone's lips. Diane led her to a conference room on the top floor, its wide windows offering a sweeping view of the city below. A small team of DOJ officials was already seated around the long table, their faces serious as they reviewed stacks of files and data spread before them. Let's get started, Diane said, taking her seat at the head of the table. Alina sat beside her, her presence commanding immediate attention. A man in his 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes leaned forward, addressing the group. The fallout from Stonebridge has opened up a Pandora's box, he began. We're already seeing reports of similar patterns in neighboring jurisdictions. Evidence tampering, racial profiling, abuses of power. This isn't isolated. Diane nodded. We anticipated this. Stonebridge was never going to be the end. It was just the beginning. The man turned to Alina. Your work was instrumental in exposing the corruption in Stonebridge. But with these new reports coming in, we're going to need you to oversee the next phase. You've proven you can handle the pressure, and frankly, we need someone who knows how to navigate the complexities of cases like this. Alina hesitated for a moment, the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her. She had barely had time to catch her breath from the last case, and already the next challenge loomed before her. But she knew there was no other option. The fight didn't wait for anyone. I'll do it, she said finally, her voice steady. But I'll need a dedicated team. People I can trust. Diane smiled faintly. You'll have it. Consider this your operation. Hours passed as they outlined their strategy, poring over maps, reports, and case files. The scope of the work was daunting. Corruption wasn't limited to Stonebridge. It was woven into the fabric of countless communities, hiding in plain sight. But Alina's resolve only hardened as the scale of the problem became clear. This was why she had joined the DOJ in the first place, to root out the rot, no matter how deep it went. As the meeting adjourned, Diane lingered, watching as Alina gathered her notes. You know, she said, her tone softer than usual. You could have walked away after Stonebridge. No one would have blamed you. Alina looked up, her expression thoughtful. I thought about it, she admitted. But then I realized walking away would have meant letting them win. And I can't do that. Diane nodded, a hint of admiration in her eyes. Just don't forget to take care of yourself in the process. Even warriors need rest. Alina smiled faintly. I'll rest when the fight's over. That night, back in her apartment, Alina sat by the window, a cup of tea warming her hands as she looked out over the city. The lights of Washington stretched endlessly before her, a tapestry of ambition, power, and possibility. She thought of the people in Stonebridge, the ones who had been silenced, who had been betrayed by the very system meant to protect them. She thought of Lauren, whose fiery determination had reminded her of the importance of allies. And she thought of Sergeant Coleman, now sitting in a cell, a symbol of the justice she had fought so hard to achieve. The fight wasn't over, it never would be. But as Alina sat there, the rain tapping gently against the glass, She allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference. Tomorrow, the work would begin again, but tonight, she allowed herself to rest, the weight of victory settling into her bones. For now, it was enough. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Alina's new assignment took shape with startling speed, her desk in the DOJ office quickly filling with files from cities across the country. The patterns of corruption she uncovered were sickeningly familiar: fabricated evidence, racially motivated arrests, illegal surveillance. Stonebridge, it seemed, was a microcosm of a much larger system. Her team, handpicked by Diane Evans, included some of the brightest and most driven individuals Alina had ever worked with. Lauren Nash, true to her word, joined as lead legal counsel. Her passion and razor-sharp mind made her an invaluable asset. Alongside her were data analysts, forensic experts, and seasoned investigators, all united by a shared mission to dismantle the systems of corruption that had gone unchecked for far too long. Weeks turned into months as Alina and her team dug deeper. Late nights became the norm, the glow of computer screens and the rustle of papers filling the office as they pieced together the threads of a sprawling web of misconduct. They faced setbacks, files that mysteriously disappeared, witnesses who recanted their statements under pressure. But they pressed on. One night, as Alina sifted through a pile of documents, her phone buzzed. It was Lauren. "I think we've got something," Lauren said, her voice tinged with excitement. "You need to see this." Within an hour, the team was gathered around a conference table, the walls lined with evidence boards covered in photos, maps, and handwritten notes. Lauren stood at the front, a stack of papers in her hands. "We found a link between Stonebridge and 3 other jurisdictions," she began. "Specifically, financial transactions that suggest a coordinated effort to suppress investigations into police misconduct." She handed a document to Alina, who scanned it quickly, her eyes narrowing as she took in the details. "These payments, they're all funneled through the same shell company," Alina said, her voice sharp. "This isn't just local corruption. This is a network." Diane, who had joined the meeting, nodded grimly. "If this is true, it means we're looking at a nationwide operation. This could go all the way to the top." Alina set the document down, her jaw tightening. "Then we take it to the top." It took weeks to build their case, each piece of evidence meticulously verified and cross-referenced. When they were ready, Alina presented their findings to the Attorney General, a no-nonsense woman named Sandra Bell, who had a reputation for taking on powerful adversaries. "This is damning," Bell said, flipping through the files Alina had laid before her. "You've uncovered something bigger than we ever anticipated." She looked up, her eyes meeting Alina's. "You'll need to testify before Congress. This needs to be made public, and it needs to happen now." The weight of the request settled over Alina like a heavy cloak. Testifying meant putting herself at the center of a storm, exposing not just the corruption they had uncovered, but also herself to scrutiny and attack. But she didn't hesitate. "I'll do it," she said firmly. The day of the congressional hearing dawned gray and overcast, the clouds hanging low over the Capitol. The hearing room was packed, reporters and cameras lining the walls as members of Congress prepared to question Alina. She sat at the witness table, her notes arranged neatly before her, her composure unshaken. As she spoke, recounting the findings of her investigation and the systemic failures that had allowed corruption to thrive, the room grew silent. Her voice was steady, her words measured, but the weight of what she revealed was staggering. She presented the evidence with clarity, each piece building upon the last to create an undeniable picture of a system in desperate need of reform. When she finished, the room erupted into murmurs. Some members of Congress looked stunned, others furious. The ripple effect of her testimony would be felt for years to come. In the months that followed, the DOJ launched a series of high-profile investigations, leading to arrests, resignations, and policy overhauls across the country. Alina's testimony became a rallying cry for reform, inspiring grassroots movements and sparking national conversations about accountability and justice. The work was far from over, but the tide was turning. For the first time in years, Alina felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the system, but for the people it was meant to serve. One quiet evening, months after the congressional hearing, Alina found herself back in Stonebridge. She stood outside the courthouse, the building that had once been the site of her greatest trial, now bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Lauren joined her, a warm smile on her face. "You didn't tell me you were coming back," she said. "I needed to see it," Alina replied, her gaze sweeping over the familiar facade. "To remind myself why we do this." Lauren nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's hard to believe how much has changed since that day." Alina smiled faintly. "Change is slow. It's painful, but it's worth it." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the journey they had taken together settling over them. Then, with a quiet resolve, Alina turned and walked away, her steps steady and unyielding. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like they were winning. And that, Alina thought, was enough for now. And just like that, justice was served. The ones who thought they could manipulate the system, who believed their power made them untouchable, were finally exposed. Alina didn't just clear her name. She set off a chain reaction that would bring real change. But this isn't just her fight. Corruption, injustice, they exist everywhere, often hidden in plain sight. So what do you think? Was justice truly done? Or is this just the beginning? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you love stories where the truth prevails, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.